Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Victoria Reade, founder of N.E.D, No Expiration Date, a broad social platform and movement to celebrate women aged 50 plus and overcome gender ageism. Today, we are joined by Ashton Applewhite, writer, activist, and media personality. She is the author of This Chair Rocks, a manifesto against ageism. Ashton is at the forefront in the growing movement to raise awareness about ageism. She co-founded Old School Anti-Ageism Clearinghouse, which is a repository for free and carefully vetted resources to educate people and challenge misinformation about aging. Ashton has been recognized for her trailblazing work by the New York Times, the New Yorker, the National Public Radio, and the American Society on Aging as an expert on ageism. Hello, Ashton. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Victoria. Good to be here.
I'm always fascinated, Ashton, by a person's journey and background. And I thought that maybe we would start by you telling us a little bit about yourself. Specifically, what don't people know about you?
I lead a pretty public life, although I've spent a lot of time on social media, and I have to say I try to restrict it sort of to my professional incarnation. No pictures of puppies or kittens. I don't have any puppies or kittens. I have worms. That's something most people don't know about me. I don't mean in my intestinal tract. I mean that I have a little garden, and I compost with worms. Um, the only form of exercise I enjoy is riding a bicycle, and I'm a really good speller, which is, of course, a skill that is rapidly becoming extinct.
Yes. So, were you a spelling bee champ?
We didn't have spelling bees, but I would have been I would have been good at them. I will tell one short spelling bee story. I was a very nerdy little girl, and I'm still nerdy. Um, and I had a wonderful teacher in 6th grade, and the last thing every Friday was a 20-word spelling test, and then you had to put a sentence. And this makes me sound so horrible, but I had a perfect record on the spelling test, and it mattered much more to me, I'm sure, than anyone else in the class. And you would do the test, bring it up to the desk. She would, um, go through it, check them, and then hand you your test, and you were done for the week. And I brought her my test, and I got all 20 words right, and I got all the sentence right, and I left the period off at the end of the sentence. And the blood drained out of my face, and she put in the period and gave me 100.
Wow.
And I've always thought of that, I'm sure in teaching 101, it's like, no, don't cheat. Don't help your students cheat. But she knew how much it meant to me. And I've always thought it was a wonderful act of kindness.
But also it shows you just the impact teachers have.
Yep.
As I shared with you, I grew up in New York. We immigrated to New York, and I still remember my teachers. They were just so supportive, and they've left an indelible impression on me.
Also the awful
So
ones.
I didn't have those in New York. They were very cool teachers. You now live in New York. So where did you grow up then?
I grew up in Washington, D.C. I traveled, backpacked around after college, because I couldn't figure out what to be when I grew up. I still didn't figure out what to be when I grew up. And I moved to New York once I ran out of money I went home, got rid of the dysentery, said hey to my folks, and moved to New York because that's what one does. And I got a job in publishing because I like to read.
Would you consider this the third chapter of your life?
Yeah, I would, I guess. I mean, I had a real job, and then I got married. I was married for 11 years, realized I couldn't stay in that marriage, and ended up writing a book called Cutting Loose: Why Women Who End Their Marriages Do So Well, which is not an anti-man book or even necessarily an anti-marriage book. It's a book about why it's hard to have an egalitarian marriage in a society that treats men and women differently. And I wrote that book obviously because I realized it was something I had to do. And 20 years later, I realized I was getting older. I was in my mid 50s, and in the very parallel, I started looking at, in the first case, life after divorce for women, and in the second case, what it was like to be older, interviewing older people, researching longevity. And in both cases, it's not that the scary stuff isn't real, it's that we only hear the scary side of the story. And so I became obsessed in both cases with why we don't have a more nuanced and accurate picture of life after divorce for women, and then of what it's like to grow old.
And when did you first become more tuned in and aware about the issue of ageism?
I started a blog in, I think was it 2007 that it launched, called this at thischairrocks.com is my website. And I have been thinking out loud about these things on that website, which is, and the blog is searchable by topic. So you can get at a lot of stuff, many of my ideas for free. It's sort of a record. You said you were a little new to the podcasting business. I was extremely new to age and aging. I had no professional credentials, I had no professional affiliations. I just started learning, forcing myself to write about it because I do not write easily, and gradually building up a body of knowledge and a point of view.
So, do you think it took time for you to formulate this thought and awareness about ageism before you took action, either through writing or your activism?
I would say the two were intertwined. I mean, in the very beginning, I had one of those word clouds. Now they sound so old-fashioned, but where it's a visual map of which words crop up the most often. And ageism was always right up there, among the biggest. So I will say it was obvious early on, just as it was obvious when I was writing about women and divorce, um, that women are at a disadvantage in conventional marriage because we live in a sexist and patriarchal society. We are disadvantaged, all humans, by living in an ageist, sexist, patriarchal, and I'll throw capitalist in their society. So, I sort of learned all the things at once, but only gradually. It turned out that a lot of the things I learned about structural issues, around about sexism and feminism, also had value in informing my ideas directly or indirectly around age bias. Right? How do we come to recognize these larger factors and the way they affect us all, although in ways that are unique to our lived experience?
And it's just so deeply ingrained, isn't it?
It is, but all bias is, I mean, it's where kids are born without bias. I just heard an anecdote the other day from someone whose granddaughter said, "Nana, what beautiful wrinkles you have." Right? She hasn't started to, watch Instagram and see. I mean, I can't say this with a smile, really young women in their early 20s starting to talk about, wrinkle prevention and fillers and stuff, preventing wrinkles. But, kids don't come into the world, racist or sexist or ageist. We
And
learn it.
there's so much, you say, so much pressure because we live in a very youth oriented society.
We do, although I think it's important to understand that ageism is any assumption about a person or a group of people on the basis of how old we think they are, including you're too young. And it is accurate to say that ageism casts a shadow across our entire life because younger people experience. Teenagers experience it when people don't take them seriously. Young people in the workforce experience it when people don't want to hire them because what could they possibly know, and so on out. It's any judgment on the basis of age, any assumption.
I think that's a good point because certainly ageism affects both men and women.
Hmm.
But I do believe it does have stronger undertones and overtones when it comes to women.
No
So, can
question.
you speak more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I know. I agree. I mean, it is no accident or coincidence that women are at the forefront of the emerging movement to end ageism because we have the most at stake. Aging is gendered. It is different to age as a woman than it is as a man. Ageism bites all of us in the ass sooner or later. I mean, for many white men, it's the first time they encounter structural bias. So that's a very powerful idea in itself. But women, of course, have experienced sexism all the way along, starting, I mean, women are never the right age, right? Especially in the workplace. Either you're too, too young to be taken seriously, then you're too sexy to be taken seriously, then you're too fertile to be taken seriously, then you're not fertile anymore, boom.
Yes.
And that is a function of living under patriarchy, which is a system that values men, privileges men over women, and women are punished for appearing, God forbid, to age, to not preserve, because we do, you're absolutely right, it is a youth obsessed society. Older people experience much more age bias than younger people. Women experience a double dose of, because of what the cultural critic Susan Sontag called the double standard of aging, that aging enhances men, again, up to a point, and
Yes.
devalues women. And another factor there is that under patriarchy, our value is linked to our reproductive status, in addition to, our wrinkle free faces and firm thighs, right? And sooner or later, that times out. And, it's just to say that I'm only valuable in the sense of, whether I could have children, whether I can still have children, whether I have produced children is deeply problematic in about 100 ways.
Well, when you think back in history, right, fecundity was uh, clearly linked to your value as a woman, right?
It was, and it still remains so in many societies. But let's not forget that if you look back in history, we didn't live much longer than our reproductive age, for one thing, which is not to excuse it. It's not to say it's okay to do that even when we had shorter lives. But um, an interesting fact is that it was during the Paleolithic era that our hominid ancestors started living long enough to have a third living generation. And that is when art happened. That is when music happened. That is when what we think of as civilization started to emerge. And there's a hypothesis, but a lot of reputable scientists have gotten behind it, called the grandmother hypothesis, which is gendered in the advantage of women, I will say, but that, having a third generation around as a repository of knowledge, right, and as able to, help with tasks and contribute to society, is what enabled human civilization to emerge. So clearly, there are benefits to having us menopausal and postmenopausal women around.
Of course, you're best known for your 2016 book, This Chair Rocks, a Manifesto Against Ageism. So tell me about the genesis of that title. Why This Chair Rocks?
I had a terrible time coming up with the title. It's just one that finally popped into my head. It was originally called, the blog was originally called, the website, So When Are You Going to Retire? Because I started out interviewing, provoked by my in-laws who were in their 80s and worked as booksellers. And they said, why don't you write about something people ask us all the time? So when are you going to retire? So in hindsight, that was my sort of safe entry into the very scary waters of age and disability. And I could write about old people who were still, watch out for that word, but who were still in the world being productive, watch out for that word,
Yeah.
in the world in sort of a conventional approved way. It did get me learning about longevity, and it did introduce me to a lot of people in their 80s and 90s who were in the world in all kinds of interesting ways. Um, but I realized at some point that I wasn't getting at the things that made me queasy, and and that I needed to talk about aging in a more complete way. And then I changed the name to Staying Vertical, which is something I tell myself to do on occasion instead of just, flaking out. And then I don't know how much later I realized that that was ableist, which is to say, working to the advantage of people who are able bodied, who can move around, who do have energy, and is discriminatory against all the people who cannot or don't want to or never could. Right? It's really problematic to privilege physical and even cognitive capacity. So that was a problem. And then I just came up with This Chair Rocks at some point. So that solved the problem.
Well, what I love about your book, coming from my background of life sciences and healthcare, is that it's also very fact
It
based,
is.
while entertaining and very stimulating and thought provoking. So I like your use of empirical data, which I think leads to people really thinking of it in more serious terms,
Thank
right?
you. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that you say both that it's fun to read, which I think it is, but also, it's, I mean, because I mean, I had a half-time job for a long time that enabled me to do this work for as a writer for the Museum of Natural History. I'm not a scientist, but I do have an extremely solid respect for solid science. I am extremely careful about what I say. I couldn't say and didn't say until recently, until more data emerged from scientists whom I trust, that ageism harms our health. We now have enough information to know that, but I am very, very careful. And frankly, if I weren't careful, I wouldn't have been able to build the reputation that I have because, as I mentioned, I don't have a whole lot of letters after my name. I'm not associated with some fancy institution. So I had to do it that way, which I'm grateful for.
You also talk about the U curve of happiness. Can you explain that?
Sure. I mean, lots of people talk about it. It was one of the very first, I would say, counterintuitive because it was counterintuitive to me at the time. Counterintuitive facts I encountered because I, like most of us, had been completely steeped in this narrative of aging as decline alone. And one of the facts I bumped into is this U curve, which is if you visualize a U with the x axis being, the years of our lives, that people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of our lives. My mother in law, whom I've already mentioned, she never did believe it. She's like, I don't believe it for a minute. Um, and I would say, well, thank you for taking issue with one of the best substantiated data points because it has been borne out by dozens of studies in the US and around the world. At first, I thought I was so skeptical. Victoria, I didn't believe any of this. I mean, I'm a skeptic. I thought, well, they must have cornered two 80-year-olds, and given them a cookie. They must have sorted out the findings according to marital status, according to health status. Not so. The data obtains across all those things and is a function of the way aging itself affects the brain, right? There's something called a positivity bias. We get better at seeing the positive, and also we simply have a longer view, right? I mean, the Stanford Longevity Center did a study fairly early in the pandemic that showed that older people, despite being more isolated, despite dying in far greater numbers, despite being at far higher risk, were more resilient than younger people simply because I don't mean to paraphrase their findings, but we've lived through stuff. We've seen stuff. So the fact that we are likely to get through it and things are likely to improve sustains us. And that's a function simply of having been around for a while.
So is it fair to say that as we age, we don't sweat the small stuff as much?
I think so. There are always, of course, exceptions, like my mother-in-law who took issue with this from the get-go, but her husband, absolutely said, I like being older. It's easier. I mean, part of it is also the fact that we live, I mean, imagine what that curve would look like if we didn't live in a world that told you that once you're north of 30, 40, 50, and those messages, that point is earlier for women, it's all going to suck, right? uh but on the other hand, one reason you're in the trough is not only because you're bombarded by those messages, but also you are likely to have maximum career responsibilities. You are likely to have maximum caregiving responsibilities. And it's also a time of reckoning. It's like you are probably not going to be a ballerina or an astronaut, unless you're on your way to those things. And that's simply part of the trajectory of our lives, right? But those are things but what weighs on us all the more heavily is this idea like, oh, if it's hard now, it's just going to get worse. And it doesn't get worse. It gets better, broadly speaking.
I think you raised such good points. And one of the things that occurred to me as well as I have really looked at ageism and how it's impacted me personally and people around me, said I do think one of the reasons why it's always an elephant in the room, right? When you talk about age, I think because it also does highlight your mortality, doesn't it?
Right, but I mean, yes, I in a narrow sense, yes, older people are reminders of mortality. There's a grain of truth or basis in every stereotype. That's for sure.
Yeah,
But I would like to push back against the idea that ageism, I mean, one reason we don't think about, I'd like to turn the table and say, not the one reason we don't think about dying is because we don't even want to think about getting older, right? I don't think that's the reason we don't want to think about aging. I think it's tied up together. I think that the work that I do, if we can accept the fact that, hello, we all woke up a day older, we are much likely to acknowledge that one of these days we are going to wake up dead, which paves the way for the really important, necessary conversations about what we might want at the end. And those conversations, everyone dreads them. The minute you have them, they are a huge relief to everyone involved because otherwise it's just this dark, looming, scary thing, elephant in the room. And just
yeah.
acknowledging, saying, yo, there's an elephant, makes the elephant turns the elephant into an elephant, if you will, instead of an impossibly amorphous, scary thing. And also, I think the reason that most of us conflate aging and dying and fear of aging around fear of dying is because we live in an ageist culture that doesn't want us to think about it. Aging is lifelong. We are aging from the minute we are born. It is not something icky that old people do. Dying is a discrete biological event at the end of all that living. People may look at me and think I'm ancient, but they don't look at me and think I'm dying. And I think people use, and also, I mean, if it were all about dying, why would there be discrimination against 45-year-old people in the workplace? They're not dying, quote unquote. I'm not dying either, right? So I think we use that argument, ooh, icky, don't want to go there because dying, as a way to rationalize the fact that we are not accepting the fact that we're aging. And I like to push back against that because it really isn't good for us.
No, I agree with you. That's what I was trying to say. Perhaps not in the most eloquent way, but it is that big elephant in the room. When you think about aging, I actually think people think about it a lot. Just opening a conversation about it, Ashton, is not commonplace. That's why I applaud your efforts and other activists in the space. And hopefully, I can also make an impact because we need to talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, we've gotten better at talking about dying. There's death cafes, but dying is sexy in a way that aging is not. There's goth stuff, there's celebrations around, like I'm thinking of Day of the Dead and ways that we mark the passage from life into death, that we don't mark the passage from one decade into another, which should be, equally, occasions to mark and to have ceremony and ritual around. In Japan, your 60th birthday, I forget the name for the word, but it is a joyful celebration because it is considered for many people a time of transition into fewer responsibilities that you don't enjoy and some time in your life to pursue things that you want to pursue, that you have more control over. So why didn't we think of that, right? There's just a million opportunities here. And a longer life, everyone in the world is living longer, and we need to develop these rules and rituals to support that and think of ways to find the meaning and around them.
So, where do you stand on celebrating birthday or not?
I don't have an opinion. I mean, I'm terrible at birthdays. I never remember anyone's birthday, but lots of people love to celebrate their birthdays. More power to them. In the world I want is a world in which your age is just there. It is a part of your identity that you claim. I am 70, about going to be 71 next month. But but that it does not have a value, positive or negative. I don't want people to applaud me when I'm 103 for being 103, and I don't want people to sideline or silence me because I'm 103 either. It should be so. I know people who don't want to give their age for the radical reason that they don't want people to make assumptions about them. I know many more people, women in particular, who don't want to give their age because they're embarrassed about it or ashamed or because they want to be taken for younger. No judgment. Just like no judgment around people who dye their hair to cover the gray, again, mostly women. People who leave early accomplishments off their resumes. Again, women face far more discrimination in the workplace than men of the same age do. These are all strategies that some of us employ because it's what we feel we need and often really do need to make our way in the world on our own terms. But as long as we do those things, we give a pass to the discrimination that makes those behaviors useful. And also, at some level, they are not good for us because they're rooted in shame about something that shouldn't be shameful.
I so agree with you. I'm really aligned with you on that. I think we should be at a point where we can state our age and there's no judgment associated with it. But like you, I don't judge anyone who's uncomfortable, because that is just a reality that we
No.
live in today,
Right.
Ashton.
And
It's
there's
just,
so many voices, telling women, mostly the voices of other women,
yes.
what you should wear, what you shouldn't wear, what you should say, what you shouldn't say. And I don't want to be one of them. It's getting older is complicated. Getting older as a woman is super complicated. And we each need to figure this out in our own way and support each other. I mean, a perfect example is like the monster brouhaha about Martha Stewart at 81 being on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And I will put a giant footnote here. It drives me nuts that I can put out a really important idea like that one, that when we do these things, we collude in a way in keeping ourselves invisible. We collude in the systems that disempower us, but we all have to make our own deals, and they change as we move through life. Again, no judgment. But that gets like a 16th, a 60th as much traffic as anything having to do with women's appearances, especially if it has to do with an older woman daring to present herself as a sexual object. And my short take on Martha Stewart is, I don't love that she's had so much work done. Yes, she is moneyed and white. Yes, it further commodifies women's appearances on the terms of patriarchy, but it is nevertheless a good thing that an older woman is being represented. Representation is key, visibility is crucial. It doesn't kick the ball very far down the road, but it nudges the ball in the right direction, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it was controversial, with some friends saying, I don't know, it's a bit racy. But to me,
Why
we are
shouldn't
so
81-year-olds be racy?
exactly. I mean, we're underrepresented 50 and up in the media, and I think for that very reason alone, Ashton, I really applauded that, just because it
Yeah, it
got
was brave.
publicity. Well, she doesn't hide her age.
No, and we need to look. I mean, she does tout anti-aging creams and sell them. So she is not innocent here. But I think when we have that kind of a visceral reaction, we need to think, geez, why am I responding so strongly? What does it kick up in me?
That's such a good point. This is something that's always disturbed me, Ashton, the competitiveness sometimes between women. And I think we can say all we want, that society is biased against us as we age, but we need to be change agents ourselves,
We
don't
are
we?
our sharpest women are other women's sharpest critics. I mean, a thought experiment, and I know I'm not even sure it's a good idea, and I know that most people couldn't do it. I'm not sure I could, but just imagine a world in which women did not comment on each other's appearance. Just like think of that. And of course then you wouldn't have the pleasure of saying you look fabulous, and I'm sure that there are times when we of course all want to do that, and we take pleasure in adorning ourselves and thinking we look good. But in some way, and we do thinking this way, in prioritizing appearance, reinforce the idea that the most important thing about women is how we look, which is, needless to say, problematic and doubly damaging to women as we age, because we are punished for, God forbid, appearing to age.
And another important point, I think, in this whole transformation of how we are viewed is the lexicon, the words that we use. I think words are very powerful. What are your thoughts about that?
There's no question. I want to thank you for mentioning old school in the introduction, and just say quickly that the old school clearinghouse is a place where we have collected all the best resources about age and aging and ageism. We also host meetups and bring people together. So sign up for the mailing list if you want to. I have a weekly meeting that anyone can come to talk about ageism. So check it out, oldschool.info. And if you enter language in the search box, you will see all kinds of expert and detailed takes. Language really does matter. Um, I will say that that one little sort of trick, or a suggestion for thinking about how it matters, is to think about how you use the words old and young,
Yes,
right? Because I hear people say, "I don't feel old." And what they really mean, how could you, what does old feel like? Right?
yes.
Old is a date. There's no such thing. There's certainly no uniform meaning, as opposed to I feel cold. We can also all agree what I feel cold feels like. Ooh, that rhymed. That was really good. But we tend that what that really means is I don't feel ugly. I don't feel incompetent. I don't feel invisible. And we can feel all those things at any age. I'll touch again on how miserable it was to be a teenager, when I felt all those things way more acutely than I have ever felt since. So try to break the habit of using old to mean insert negative thing, and young to mean insert positive thing. Young at heart. What the hell does that mean? Well, people
Yes.
don't have young hearts. You mean energetic? Do you mean creative? Do you mean playful? Those are all things we can be at any age, right? Just like you could be depressed and no fun to be around at any age, too.
And I think you find it a little pejorative, don't you? Or it's one of your pet peeves when
There's so many of them.
older women are referred to as young ladies. You don't find that to be actually complimentary.
Well, you know, when someone calls me a young lady, I'm not a young lady. So the only thing it's really doing is drawing attention to the fact that I am not young. Because to be seen as older in the society is to be seen as having less value. I don't believe that I have less value because I'm older. And I don't want to be complimented on the basis of a term that is based on a sexist and ageist idea. And also, if I accept the compliment, which means that, I mean, I guess I'm really conflating two things. I'm thinking of someone saying you look great for your age, right? Which
Yes,
is kind of related. They're both saying, you look young, you should look young, right? I
right.
can only accept that compliment at the expense of other people who don't happen to look as good as I do. There's no way that 70 looks, this is the way it looks on me. And a really good answer. I mean, young lady is just condescending and icky. I didn't like being called a young lady when I was a young lady, right? It's no one likes that. It's a term that doesn't have anything to do with the specificity of me, whatever age I happen to be. And a really good answer to an ageist comment is simply, what do you mean by that?
That's a good point.
Resist the tendency, which I have done, like, why are you calling me young lady? But what do you mean by that? And that's what we want to do. We do need, if we want to change the culture, and it needs changing, we do need to provoke those moments that are uncomfortable, where we
Yes,
challenge these messages, that are derogatory and stereotyping.
very good point. For me, I really try to be conscious. I don't use the words old or young, or I just simply state the age. And honestly, Ashton, throughout my life, I have never focused on age. So this is not a new revelation for me. It's not like the younger Victoria transformed after 50 to all of a sudden be self-conscious about age. It's just not, to me, it's just one metric of a person's life. That
Why do
to
you
me,
think how did you escape the conventional narrative, do you think?
well, I think part of it is because I'm an immigrant from another culture, from
Mhm.
Asia, where we viewed aging very differently. In fact, I don't recall anyone, Ashton, ever talking about age.
Interesting.
And we lived in multi-generational
Very
culture,
important.
family, like you were talking about. And my grandmother was such a strong influence in my life, and I just thought that was normal and
So you're
natural.
you're really beautifully positioned to speak about this from the strength of your experience. I speak about it from a sort of a wonky, abstract, you know, political point of view. But if if you say, "Gee," and come up with an anecdote from your culture or your past where people saw things differently, that's super powerful.
Yeah, so that's one. And of course, me having a healthcare background, which is one of the things I wanted to touch on with you, is of course this gender health gap, right? Which I experienced and saw firsthand in my leadership positions. And certainly, I don't think it can be disputed that patients and members, for example, of health plans, stratified differently based on age group. There's some actuary out there doing some calculation based on your age that would perhaps have a detrimental impact really on your treatment and on your care.
Well, it's
So
another healthcare is another example of this idea called intersectionality, that we each have multiple identities as women. You are an immigrant. We have our socioeconomic status. We have whether we're fat or thin, all these things, and they each shape our proximity to power and visibility in a society that privileges the male, the thin, the white, the young, and so on. And we see tremendous discrimination in healthcare on the basis of both age and gender. Less research is done on women. I mean, I'm sure you could actually speak to that more with more expertise than I. I remember going. I'll mention my mother-in-law one more time. Her husband was sent to the emergency room with something that turned out to be very minor, but he's kind of out of it in the bed. And she was a small woman, and she's sitting in a chair at the end of the bed with me and her son, my partner, and the doctor keeps talking to my partner. And Ruth is smart as a tack, right? Smart as a whip, and she's worried about her husband. And I got down on my knees on the ground and put my head next to hers in the off chance, and I wish I'd been more heavy handed and said, please talk to Mrs. Stein. But he still would not talk to her. So we know that there are, that both these forms of bias are very strong in healthcare. They get worse with age. I mean, I would like another thought experiment. Imagine if your age were on the second page of your medical chart.
yes,
It belongs there. We don't want to erase age. I don't want a world where ageless is a plus. Our years are part of what make us psychologically, certainly biologically, and they're part of our clinical portrait. But the minute there's a number, and I'm not just saying this is not just true of physicians or nurses, it is true of everyone
yes.
because we live in an ageist world. The minute you have that number, though, all sorts of associations. Oh, I know someone that age who just died. Oh, I know someone that age that just had triplets. Oh, and so we all have assumptions that click into place when we have a number. Suppose the doctor had to assess the patient's status without access to that number until page two.
And this is why the World Health Organization is really focused on ageism.
I love that. I mean, it's true that the World Health Organization is wants to increase health span. They acknowledge that population aging is a permanent global demographic trend. So they looked at what can we do to extend the number of healthy years that people have, and they realized that the number one barrier was not clean water, was not more roads, was not even gender equity, although that would help. It
Yeah.
was ageism. And that's why they launched their global campaign to combat ageism, which is excellent. One more plug for old school. Good luck navigating the World Health Organization's website. It's impenetrable. Go to oldschool.info and enter WHO, and you will find it right there. That's the whole idea behind old school. Anything to do with ageism, you can find it there. And I love pointing out, it's not the World Old People Organization. They're not in the oldness business, they're in the health business. And there is increasing evidence that ageism harms our health. I will recommend a book called Breaking the Age Code by Becca Levy of Yale. Guess where you can find it? Old School, enter Levy, where she has done almost all the fantastic research showing the way attitudes towards aging affect how our minds and bodies function at the cellular level, right? I mean, her latest study shows they took a whole bunch of old people, they studied them for a long time, and they discovered that people who started to exhibit what is called mild cognitive impairment, which may or may not be a thing, who were then exposed to less ageist ideas, if they were exposed to less ageist ideas, more positive ideas, they reversed the cognitive decline reversed. I've never seen reverse in this context. Whereas people who remain mired in assumptions that aging is just equivalent to, disability, decline, that mindset makes us more vulnerable to exactly what we fear. If you want to read about the study, go to my website, thischairrocks.com, click on blog, thischairrocks.com/blog, and it's something I posted about just a few weeks ago. It's at the top of the list. Or again, search for Levy.
I have to say, Ashton, I see that firsthand because my father is in his late 80s, sharp as a tack, living autonomously, big believer in fitness. And it's a lot of it is really, he attributes to his positivity, and he has outlived most of his contemporaries.
Yeah, it's a bit of a trap in that, it's a very capitalist neoliberal idea that if you just have the right attitude and eat enough kale, it's all going to be great. And we are all hostage to enormous forces that are not under our control, especially if we don't have money, right? Especially
Yeah,
if we are women, especially if we have a disability. Put those things together, be a disabled woman of color, you face enormous obstacles to good health in late life. Many of these things, even the really rich white guys who think that we're going to cure aging, big air quotes around that, as if it were doable and as if it were a good idea, even those guys wake up a day older, right? And the one thing though that we can control is our attitude, and attitudes toward aging affect again how our minds and bodies work at the cellular level. So if you want to age healthy, check your age bias.
that's the whole mind body connection that
Yes,
you're
it
talking.
is.
I don't know if you're familiar about the MSU, Michigan State University study where they really looked at the perception of older adults and aging around the world. I thought it was so very interesting. And they looked at the fact that older adults are one of the only stigmatized groups that we all become a part of someday, right? And they were struck by the fact that they're a group of people who are treated poorly, yet we're destined to become them one day, right?
Well,
And
yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, all prejudice requires an other. What sociologists call othering, other sports team, other religion, other nationality. The weird thing about ageism, in the sense of the prejudice against older people, which is most ageism, is that it is prejudice against our own older selves. It is distancing from and apprehension about becoming, I mean, and everyone is older, future old. It makes no sense. But I have to say, no prejudice makes sense. They're all irrational.
but they also made a distinction in the fact that there's higher ageism in countries like the US, Germany, Ireland, South Africa, and Australia because they're individualistic countries as opposed to China, Japan, Korea, India, and Brazil that are, they call them collectivistic countries that
Yeah.
focus on cohesion. So I think that's why I feel blessed having grown up in a country where we had that sense of community and cohesion.
Yeah, I mean, my ears perked up at a word that you used. You said your dad was living autonomously.
Yes.
And one of the a sidebar in my book, I have these big pull quotes, is a quote from a Dutch gerontologist named Jan Bars. Autonomy requires collaborators. And it seems
Good
like a
point.
paradox, but it's not. As we cognitive decline is not inevitable, as your father proves, but physical decline, we lose strength, we lose mobility. We all need, at a minimum, help with lifting heavy things and putting heavy things up high. Or, and perhaps we aren't able to drive safely anymore or whatever, go along, travel by ourselves. We need collaborators to figure out how we can do the things we want to do. And that is a collectivist idea. Capitalism emphasizes individuality because the more people are isolated from each other, the more we buy, the more we spend, the less we share, right? The less we recycle. And so it's, societies where, I mean, that's why it's great to see so much emphasis emerging around bringing people of all ages together, multi generational housing, essential.
Well, I'd like to end our conversation with just thinking about legislation and policy, because my concern is, are we really doing enough? So, for example, I've read that Europe at this point has is currently the oldest region in the world, a title that they will hold until 2050. I didn't know if you were aware of
Huh, I
that.
would have guessed Japan, but
No, then Latin America and Asia are projected to age most rapidly through 2050. But right now, the winner is Europe. They have become very, very aware, and they've created what's called the Age Platform EU. It's a network of nonprofits.
you can find it on Old School.
Oh, there you go. That aims to give voice to the 200 million citizens age 50 plus. But it's occurred to me, Ashton, are we doing enough?
No, of course we're not. I mean, are we doing enough for racism? Are we doing enough to give immigrants a fair crack at a good life? If, no, we're not there. But on the other hand, it's never enough. We can't, sometimes people say, when are we going to end ageism? Well, we're never going to have a world free of prejudice. Uh, and a corollary to that is the fact that all these different forms of prejudice compound and reinforce each other. The flip side of that, which is really I find a very uplifting idea, is that when we work against any form of prejudice, we chip away at the fear and ignorance that underlie them all. If you are working to be less racist, you are making the world a better place for older people of color. If you're working against sexism, you're making the world better for half of humanity. We're all going to get old if you're working against. So it's not zero sum. It is the opposite. It can feel overwhelming, like, oh my God, I gave it I bought the cookies. I showed up at the bake sale. I gave it the office. But whatever you did, helps the cause as a whole. We do need more legislation. We do need, but I am, and I can think of examples, and the end of my book gives a whole bunch of examples. But I am in the culture change business. We need underlying, an analogy I would make is think about the women's movement, right? Think about how we need a million initiatives to give women health equity, to give women, paid childcare support. How about that? And so on. But, but but sexism, the glass ceiling, we need to bake in an awareness of the structural issues that women everywhere face, or all these little policy fixes are just going to be band-aids. We need fundamental culture change around the value and visibility of older people, of women, and of older women.
But don't you think, Ashton, those two go hand in hand?
Of
However,
course.
I'm so admiring of like all the social initiatives, like the gender identity revolution, right, and LGBTQ movement, that is just amazing and powerful in the way that they have accelerated its execution in society, where there's widespread acceptance, maybe not unanimous, of course.
Yeah, we should absolutely take heart from that. And that has to do with sex. And we live in a Puritan culture. And only some people are queer. Everyone gets older. So I think we need to see that as those as wonderful examples and learn from them.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Ashton. I have so enjoyed my conversation with you.
My pleasure, Victoria.